Hello, and welcome. Welcome. Today we are going to be talking about Karl Tomm's IPScope. And I added Tom to the third edition of Mastering Competencies, and he's also in the fourth edition. So that's why you're seeing the cover here. But welcome, everyone. And as we go through this webinar today, feel free to put, if you're watching live, if you're watching the recording on Zoom, I'm not sitting there and I can't answer your Q&A, but if you're live with me today, please put your questions in the Q&A and I will make sure I answer those. So really excited to have you here today. I love Karl Tomm's model and I am so excited to share it with you, and especially those of you who are in the process of licensure and having to, for marriage family therapy licensure and having to memorize a lot of systemic theories. I really think Tomm's approach can be super useful to just understanding systems. It's just kind of I think a 21st century kind of way to understand some of the key issues in marriage and family therapy systemic work. So in the fourth edition, Karl Tomm's model is in the integrative chapter, and I will tell you a little bit about that in just a minute. So, but you'll find it in chapter 4, integrative chapter, and Karl Tomm kicks off that chapter. So let's go ahead and get started. So Karl Tomm is a family therapist who's been around for many, many years. He has most of his career, he was based in at the University of Calgary. He is based in the University of Calgary. He's actually an MD. And many, many years ago, he is part of the pioneering crew. He got a large grant for their family counseling center at the University of Calgary. And he is one of the only family therapists I know who actually was able to convince the local government that they were not going to do traditional DSM-5 diagnosis and still get funding. And in lieu of using traditional diagnostic criteria, they developed this IPScope for kind of looking at what is going on. He developed it with Dan and Sally St. George, Dan Wolf, who are actually two of my long-term colleagues. Are also very active in collaborative therapy, and Tom Strong, who also does work in the area of narrative. And yet this approach is very systemic. And so that's one of the reasons I love Karl Tomm. Both he and I talk a lot about both the systemic and from postmodern perspectives and kind of brings it all together. And hence, both of us are in this collaborative chapter. You go figure that out. Okay. It is very a systemic approach that has a very relationally postmodern, conceptually systemic, looking at interpersonal patterns. And when you look at family therapy, it is an art of understanding interpersonal patterns and how to identify them. And in particular, Karl Tomm's work focuses on those complementary patterns, which are addressed in almost every single approach. In my Therapy That Works Unifying Framework, the second level of the first level, the second half of the first level is complementary patterns. And it is so on my to-do list. I got a couple other books to write, but someday I will write the book on complementary patterns from traditional psychodynamic, all the way through humanistic, CBT, postmodern, systemic. And when you really look at the difference across all the different theories, which is part of what I love to do and what I do for my work, it is how people identify complementary patterns in each approach that really is where most of the diverse language and jargon, quote unquote, comes from. And so what I love about what Karl Tomm and his colleagues have done in Calgary is that they have really focused on this and developed it into a system that you can use in multiple different ways. So multiple phases of therapy and looking both at therapeutic relationship as well as client relationships, as well as their wellness patterns, as well as their, negative patterns. So it is it's just such a simple and elegant approach once you get the hang of it. So I'm so excited to share it with you today. So he calls it the IPScope, with IP meaning the interpersonal patterns, or the IPs, and we'll be talking about a lot of IPs today. And it is used to observe clients, couples, families, even individuals and individual dynamics. Um, the same focus on complementary patterns just kind of replicates across all different levels of systems and problems. And so you're looking at how these interactional patterns organize around behaviors, both problem behaviors as well as wellness behaviors. And so interpersonal patterns are defined as recurrent and relatively stable. So even if a couple, argues about different things, they have relatively the same pattern for interacting. So, which is really fascinating. When you begin to identify the underlying pattern, it really becomes a lot more simple. And so if you have studied emotionally focused couples therapy, this is really at the heart of that work, is very similarly looking at primarily the pursuer distancer is the main pattern, but obviously there are other ones that they can look at, but they are surprisingly, even if the couple's arguing about different things, that same fundamental push and pull seems to be fairly consistent. Usually with couples, you'll see they typically have the same roles, but you can have a couple where they flip the roles. I've had couples do that less often, but it does definitely happen. Interpersonal patterns are generally mutually reinforcing. And so, when one person pursues, the other one distances, and they reinforce each other's behaviors. And they tend to be complementary, which is, one is pursuing and one is distancing. And so they're kind of moving in opposite directions. And so you can have overfunctioning and underfunctioning, even within the individual or within a relationship, right? So even our patterns around depression or anxiety can similarly, whether they're intrapsychic or interpersonal, we tend to see these complementary patterns, which are, typically developed from a polarity of some kind that creates the pattern. And Tom, even though it sounds super, super systemic, he is fundamentally also got a postmodern lens and refers to these descriptions as serviceable fictions, tools that help the therapist to facilitate treatment. And I do remember at the end of my doctoral program, I marched into my dissertation chair. He was my major professor in my grad program. And I said, "Why didn't you tell me? Everything's a metaphor." And I remember him saying, "I've been trying to say it for the last 4 years. It's just taken you this long to fully grasp what I meant by that." So saying it's a serviceable fiction, what Tom is trying to get across here is that these descriptions of these patterns are what we are using to help us help our clients. Okay, they're not some deep ultimate truth about the nature of this client and their value as a human. It is a serviceable fiction. These are descriptions that clinicians use to help them help clients better. And so in some ways, that's what all theories are. They are just stories that therapists use to help us help clients solve their problem better and more efficiently. So please don't fall into the trap, which we often do, is taking our theories to be about some fundamental truth or essence of humanity. These are serviceable fictions that work for us at this time and how we help people to help others. And they're just tools. And so don't ever, you need to revise and update and adjust them as you go along and continually revise them. I remember once a long time ago, I was at a training with Boscolo, from the Milan Institute. And I remember they were prepping before a live demonstration. And he says something like, "Oh my goodness, I think we need to stop talking because I'm beginning to believe the hypothesis that we are talking about." And so the idea here is all of these hypotheses we have about our clients, they are serviceable fictions to help us help them, but we need to be careful to not believe ourselves and fall in love with our ideas or our hypotheses about what's going on with our client, like we know what's going on with them better than they do. That can be a dangerous thing. So in terms of the interpersonal patterns, there are several different types. And I love this because Karl Tomm and his team at Calgary have helped give you a way of looking at things that you can keep using in different areas of treatment. So the most common one is what's called a pathologizing interpersonal patterns. So these are patterns that basically relate to our symptoms and what we're coming to get help for. But they increase negativity and suffering in one or both people who are interacting. So PIPs are what we're trying to stop with we're trying to interrupt those, find alternatives to PIPs. Healing our interpersonal patterns are HIPs. And these are the patterns that facilitate forgiveness or insight to minimize future PIPs. So you're using the HIPs to fix the PIPs. And if you think of EFT, they talk a lot about, addressing attachment injuries. That's a good example of a HIP. So every single theory you can, has a way, at least in family therapy, of addressing PIPs. And many of them also have these HIPs, which are how do you help facilitate forgiveness and reconnection and reconciliation in relationships. So these are actually healing interactions. Then there are also wellness interactions in addition to the healing interactions. And these are the ones that bring forth competence, positivity, and intimacy. So the whips are what you're trying to get your clients to do, a lot more whips and a lot fewer HIPs. And oftentimes there needs to be some healing patterns in between. Not always. There are certainly situations where that's not true, but if you're familiar, like I said, with EFT, talks a lot about the importance of if there's been an attachment injury, which is when one person kind of reaches out to the other in a great moment of need, you're going to need something like a HIP to get you to the whips. If you think of solution-focused therapy, right? Solution-focused therapy is kind of like, how do we get the whips to happen? We'll do a HIP if we need to. And in solution focus or not, you can talk a whole lot about the PIPs. Like, okay, let's identify what a whip would be or what a whip has been, and let's do more of that, the wellness patterns. So the wellness patterns are really what you're trying to stabilize in therapy. No matter which approach you're using, that is truly the goal. And I fully agree with Tom and his team that, identifying, labeling, identifying these wellness interaction patterns is so important. I have been doing couple family therapy for 3 decades now. And I think one of the things that routinely surprises me, especially with my couples and even with my families, but couples in particular, they can come in and go, yeah, we just had a great week. And I'm like, so what was different? They're like, I don't know. We just didn't fight this week. And I'm like, so believe it or not, I have to work so hard to help couples identify what the wellness pattern is, because it's almost like there was no problem. And so it just kind of like they don't notice that it happened. And so it takes a lot of work for most clients to identify those wellness interaction patterns. Oh, so, like when you came home and you, just went and started, hanging out with the kids so she could do dinner, that like created this wellness pattern where there's less tension. Yeah. And, why did you go and hang out with kids instead of going up to your room like you normally do? Okay, so let's look at how that created a virtuous cycle. But most of my clients, especially couples in particular, but even with families, when there's a parent who I kind of expect to sort of notice when I do X, my child's behavior gets better or worse. Even in families, it is not common. And at the individual level, because all of these, patterns also can exist in our psyches. And if you think of internal family systems, it's taking all of that systemic metaphor and looking at how intrapsychically we kind of have these internal patterns as well, that individually we often don't notice what we're doing on a good day versus a bad day. And so sometimes you have some idea of what you did differently, but like looking at how that internal process creates a wellness process versus a pathologizing process. So again, pathologizing interpersonal patterns, those are your symptoms. The healing ones are anything that needs to be done, especially between people, to reconcile, facilitate forgiveness between our clients. And the wellness is kind of your solution, what you want to have more of. And then transforming interpersonal patterns are often refers to what we as clinicians do, but we're facilitating a move from a PIP to a WIP. And so you can, and I describe some of this in the textbook, you can take every theory in any of my textbooks and, look at how each one has a way of assessing PIPs, except for solution focus. We're the only ones who don't do that. And then there is a way that clinicians, try to transform and move our clients from a PIP to a WIP. Continuing, there are more IPs. I am not done with IPs. There are deteriorating interpersonal patterns, which are DIPs. And this one, the IP makes sense. This is where behaviors that lead one to go from your wellness pattern back to your pathologizing PIP, right? So the deteriorating patterns is you get the wellness pattern, somewhat established, and then you slip back to the more symptomatic patterns. And those are called the dips. And so you're looking at how that kind of goes back, how you slip, and all of us as humans, we all know we have dips. And then finally, they talk about skips, which are sociocultural interpersonal patterns. So this is looking at either beliefs and values and societal discourses that inform our internal interaction patterns, and they can either be a negative or beneficial effect. And so when you're looking at skips, you're looking at the social cultural element to what might be going on in our internal identities. Okay, guys, we got this. PIPs, WIPs, HIPs, skips, dips, tips. You're with me? Okay, good. So you're looking for the skips, both the skips, the social, cultural discourses that might support the problem, the PIPs, and you're going to look for skips that support the wellness interaction patterns, or the WIPs. I know, a lot of acronyms that end with IP kind of makes it fun. So let's look at some examples of what a PIP might be. So you have defending and criticizing, very common in both couples and families, distancing, pursuing. And so a lot of EFT, that's one of their main ones they look at. And then resisting and controlling, often seen with parents and children. So oftentimes the more, let's say a parent is trying to micromanage or control their child, the more the child resists, the more the parent tries to control, the more the child resists. In romantic relationships, you might have one person pursuing for closeness, the other one feels overwhelmed and distance. So the pursuer gets more anxious and pursues harder, which gets the distancer to pull back. So you can create these symptomatic patterns that underlie the problems that clients are bringing to us. Both families and couples have lots of defending, criticizing interaction patterns. So looking at how these patterns, it's like the fundamental type of dynamic going on. The topic can change, but oftentimes there's the one critical party and the other person is defending. The criticizing, defending, you'll often see that flip back and forth in a couple or a family, but particularly couples. You can have PIPs with power differentials. So you can have a more domineering and a more submissive partner, And so what that means is the domineering or dismissing partner tends to have more power and influence over the dynamic than the person with less power. So oftentimes in classic systems theories, the issue of power differential really was not well addressed or clearly addressed in the early systemic work. And I think many of us in the field are very thankful for Karl Tomm and his colleagues for bringing us a working model for understanding, yes, there is still an interactional dynamic, but when there's a big power differential, the person on the bottom half of the relationship has a lot less influence over that dynamic compared to the person with most of the power. So if you think of an authoritarian parent, the child, yes, there might be dismissing and acquiescing, or domineering and submitting, or even domineering and defiance. You can get that one too, right? But the child in many of these situations does not have the same amount of power to influence this dynamic than the parent. And again, in abusive couple relationships, you can have a very similar dynamic where there's a very domineering partner and a very submissive partner. And so the person who's more dominant, so you can say both people, theoretically from a pure whatever systemic place, you can say they're reinforcing each other's behaviors. Yes, that's true. But the person who has more power and wields it in a domineering, authoritative way, even if it takes the form more of dismissing someone, the other person has less influence in this type of relationship. So just kind of being aware of the power differentials. Then we have the hips, which are healing interactional patterns. And so this is, apologizing and forgiveness, and it can create a positive healing interaction. There is performing more acts of competence, and then the other person noticing and positive acknowledging. So in a couple or family system, you can have these healing interaction patterns that kind of shift and heal and move things in the right direction. They're not quite the wellness pattern because they're more reparative than they are like, this is going to be the new norm. This is more healing when systems have gotten out of balance. Then there are the transforming ones. So this is often what the therapist is doing. The tips are what we, the clinicians, do. So the more we can ask about experience, the more the client might disclose about their experience. And so we ask more, we get more disclosure, and we have this kind of opening and learning about the client. Using reflexive questions, which are questions that are open-ended, there is no agenda, to get them to just reflect on these interactive patterns, right? New possibilities, new distinctions are made. And so that helps open up, kind of reinforces itself. So wellness interpersonal patterns, this is the goal. This is what we're going for. So you can have things like giving constructive feedback, recognizing and correcting mistakes, leads to more constructive feedback. And you create a very positive interaction cycle, even when there are difficulties. Showing affection and appreciation, showing affection and respect, which is responded to with appreciation and respect, creates this very positive interactive cycle. So like in families, saying things like, please, thank you, I love you, I appreciate you. The more that families have these patterns, these are wellness patterns, and they are important. And so, I've heard people say, oh, can't say please and thank you all day long. And I'm like, you really can, and it's okay. To have that appreciation and respect can be real important. So this is looking at how these interactions and how couples can interact to create, to stabilize the wellness. And so with couples, families, individuals, we're always looking for these moments where they brought out the best in each other. Maybe that's a good way to think about it, right? Like with parents and children, the more, let's say a child takes responsibility, the more the parent can appreciate that and give them more freedoms. And, the more freedoms they have, that will probably hopefully inspire the child to, be more responsible and to create this positive, interaction cycle. And so having these patterns well established, within couples, within families, and even within ourselves, going to bed early gets me up on time, which gets me exercising and meditating every morning, starting off in the right place. So we all, these can even come down to very practical patterns that we have, but there is this whole cycle and rhythm, and these behaviors where there's this mutual reinforcement of positive, behaviors within ourselves and between ourselves. So deteriorating interpersonal patterns, this is where you go from, you move from a wellness to a PIP, a pathologizing pattern. So this is where, scrutinizing, let's say a child's performance, makes someone more self-conscious or awkward in performing. You see this happen all the time with couples and in families where, it can be a parent or a partner is, the other person tries to do something helpful. Let's say they try to take out the trash, and they don't do it quite to the other person's standard. Like in my house, the kids will often take out the trash, but they forget to put the liner back in, right? And if what happens is they go and they do the heroic effort of taking the trash out, and my first focus becomes, well, you forgot the liner again. Then that really makes them not want to do it as much. And so it's really funny. At a certain point, my eldest son is like, and my younger son because I'm like, thank you all for doing that. And oh, please don't forget to get that liner. And so trying to keep it light. And the two boys one day had negotiated that the older son will take out both the recycling and the trash if the younger son will put the two liners on. And the younger son's like, like, sign me up. I get the 2-second task and you're going to do the 2-minute task. Like, okay. I don't know why my older son hates that. I'm like, oh, that's not the best deal I've ever heard. But they found their pattern. They work together as a team to figure out, how they can both maximize and get the most out of it. So that's kind of the wellness pattern in my house. If you can negotiate with your brother how to divide the chores other than how they've been assigned, I don't care, because it creates the motivation, the positivity. And if every time they did chores, they rarely do chores up to my standards, for the record, if anyone was wondering. If I scrutinize them more than I cheer them on and thank them, we would not have, I would be doing a lot more chores probably, and we'd have a lot more conflict, I think, in the house. So that's a good example. The scrutinizing of performance is a very common thing you will see in families. Then there is, withholding information, failing to learn, because with more information gets, withheld. And so you can create these negative patterns where families will just kind of spiral backwards. And I think as clinicians, we've all seen that. So again, so here's a good one. When we deny the free expression of anger in healthy ways, obviously, oftentimes that anger can turn inward against the self. And my absolute favorite of all of these dynamics is this really fascinating dynamic I've seen over the years, where the more, so we tend to see either self-criticizing or other criticizing. And I've become over the years to slowly realize that if you're critical of others, you tend to be even more critical of yourself. And if you tend, and sometimes all you hear is the criticism of others. And those people often sound like they have a lot of quote unquote self-esteem. But if they're running around criticizing almost everyone they meet and everything they encounter, typically they are actually that hard on themselves, even if they seem to present like, I've got it all together. As your therapist and you talk to them long enough, you realize they're criticizing themselves as harshly, even though they don't show it on the outside. On the other hand, when you've got someone who's constantly criticizing themselves and I'm not good enough, and oftentimes on the surface, they are very pleasant to others. When you scratch below the surface as their therapist, you soon discover there's often a lot of unspoken criticism and judgment of others that creates this negative pattern. And one of the strangest things I've learned about human psychology or psyches, or however you want to think of it, is as you learn to accept yourself more, you learn to accept others and their humanity, and vice versa. As you learn to truly accept others as they are, you become more accepting of yourself. And those two things are definitely interrelated. And so this also fits into some of the individual dynamics that you will see in your clients. So again, are these patterns real? It's better to really think of them as a social construct that we use. They're held very tentatively. We look at these labels, we notice the patterns, but they're held. They're very fluid. We can rename them. We can label them. We can redescribe them at any time. So these are constantly edited, revised, to help us better understand what's going on, knowing that none of these verbal labels are truly capturing the essence of who someone is or the essence of some kind of pattern. It is just a description we can use to hopefully help shift these negative patterns that we would like to have differently. So bringing forth HIPs, or healing interaction patterns. So sometimes the first place to always begin is to identify the family's natural, healing patterns of forgiveness and reconciliation, bring them out and notice them using circular questions. And certainly Karl Tomm's early work, he did beautiful work around, I love circular questions. Circular questions, if you need a refresher, circular questions, Milan team pioneered them, but they are questions that family therapists ask to help identify the interaction patterns. And you often can do it by comparing and contrasting. You can look at behavioral sequences. You can, look at before and after. You can have hypotheticals. So, it can be something like, when mom's upset, which kid is the most changes their behavior the most to help get her in a better mood, and who is the most likely to disappear when these. So you're looking at all these differences, to just notice the pattern, put them into words, um, and so that's what these circular questions are. And so then there's imagine. Another way to work with healing patterns is to imagine possible hips. So if you can't find any, like the family or couple doesn't have any readily identified patterns, imagining what behavior would either contradict or preclude one of the behaviors in the PIP, or would act as a healing interaction to increase trust, usually is what it is in most systems. Looking at the complementary behaviors. So looking for what type of behavior would reinforce and stabilize a hip. So oftentimes with parents, who we generally expect the parents to do the lion's share of shifting some of these interaction patterns, I will often, tell parents who, let's say that the negative pattern is a parent gets super critical, I would instruct the parents then to catch their kid doing something well and compliment them. So that would be the opposite. And so by just noticing and complimenting, works really well with partners too. It works really well with children. By just noticing what they're doing right rather than what they're doing wrong, you can, kind of trigger a healing interaction pattern, especially if you do it more than once. So you can help create an interaction, either in session or out of session, where you talk about what that healing pattern might look like. And you can use reflexive questions to bring forth the component, of the hip. So like, I don't know, got the kid taking out the trash who never puts on the liner. I know this is a minor problem, but sometimes it's helpful to just deal with simple problems. You can say, so when you're walking back, why is it you don't think to put the liner in? What are you doing instead? Where is your mind? What are you thinking about? And sometimes just having those conversations and realizing, you know, my kid is doing the chore because his mom asked him to, and his heart's in the right place. But boy, as soon as the trash is in the can, he is like, his mind is off on whatever happened at school. He's going to go call a friend or play a game, and making sure that all the rest of the chore is taken care of. He's just, I've asked him, his mind just often with a lot of things. It's like, I do the first step. He does the first step, and remembering to do the other steps takes more time, right? It's going to take time for me to, patience for me. But just kind of even understanding that helps me feel less resentful, and and helps. These reflexive questions can really create people to think in different ways. I will tell you, there was one day, my son gets up early to go to jazz band, so we have to leave the house at 7:05. So we're up early at like 6:30 and 6:15, 6:30 in the kitchen. Honestly, neither of us are 100% really awake, and I'm sitting there making my tea, and normally while my tea water is boiling, I'm emptying the dishwasher half the time. And I'll never forget, there is one of the best moments in my parenting life. My son walks over, and without a word, because he's half asleep as well, he just starts helping me unload the dishwasher. And I was like, I'm like, oh my God, is this like really happening? Is there like a candid camera somewhere? And I'm like, what do you even say? Because I'm like, I know I'm going to like compliment, but I don't want to, he's 14, you don't want to make too big of a deal. And finally, at one point I'm like, I asked him, I said, so thank you so much. That's just so amazing. I really appreciate your help. You have no idea how much that means to me. And at a certain point, I'm like, so what made you think of even coming over to help me? And he says, at some point I had said something, we had some conversation, I'd asked some kind of reflective question where it just clicked in, like, if you live in this house, you need to help. It's not fair if one person does all the work. He says, and it's just the one thing that he is down at. If I'm ever emptying a dishwasher, no matter how tired he is, he jumps up and he helps with that particular chore. Now, getting a trash can liner on the trash can, totally different story. But this is, again, these reflexive questions can hit people and reframe things, and you just never know which one's going to stick. And for whatever reason, my son somehow got a message about this, always helping And so asking these questions can help you see the good intention. And so certainly when I see him do things like that, I'm able to be a little more forgiving with the trash can liner. Oh yeah, that's just not his. Still needs to work on it, but it creates a little more give and take in relationships. So this is a good example of, let's say you have a family pattern here where there's pressuring from the parent and there's resistance on the other side. You also see this with couples where one person is, oh, honey, take out the trash, right? And then there's the resisting, oh, I forget, or, oh, not now, I'm busy, whatever it is. And you want to switch that into a healing pattern where the person who's like pressuring is inquiring, asking about what's going on, and the other person is able to actually put into words and respond as to what was going on. Ah, yes. I will tell you, I was flying with my kids, and my kids are usually very well behaved, right? They're 10, they're 14. I rarely have to like tell them to stop doing anything. But when we fly, by the end of the flight, they are always like poking each other and laughing, and they're like hysterical. And I'm like, I feed you kids like with expensive airport food. What is going on here? And I remember, and so this is where this part of me is like, you gotta behave, we're landing, you know? And then at a certain point, I just asked, so what goes on? What is it with plane flights that make the two of you crazy? And finally, it was my eldest son was just like, I get so bored on a plane. Even with the movies, even with the handheld, whatever, so it's the boredom. Okay, so it's boredom. So how do we work on the boredom for the next time? And so I really, um, I really can't imagine because boy, I feel like they got a fair amount of technology at their disposal and they're still bored and for him, it was actually being sitting down. And it was funny because when he even talks to his friends on the phone, he walks. He's one of those people who just does laps. He will walk. He doesn't even sit down and play video games for long periods of time. He just likes to be in motion. And so at least it helped me, understand more. We can come up with better solutions. And so that's the healing pattern, going from this pathologizing pattern where there's a lot of snap judgments and this pursue distance, pressure, resistance, all of that. You want to switch it to another sort of interaction. So circular questions are certainly a core technique where you're making distinctions and clarifying, and this is where it could be about systems of beliefs, or what's going on for you, like on the plane. Like I couldn't make sense of why their behavior was so bizarre on a plane, right? So asking these distinctions, because I noticed it was only on the planes they behave this way. We get the clarifying questions, I get more information, it helps me see things. Behavioral effect questions, so when one person does this, person A does this, person B interprets it in a way that makes them have the opposite, usually complementary pattern, and understanding those dynamics and connecting those dots about, when you walk in the door, with a, oh gosh, during the pandemic, I had several couples where the pattern was they have all day in a very stressful meeting, and because they don't have the 30 or longer, 30, 60-minute commute that you typically would had pre-pandemic in Los Angeles, they get off the stressful phone call from work and immediately in their kitchen, and the partner's asking for help with the kids, and the other, you have all this tension because there wasn't the wind down, and so we had to create all these artificial wind down periods that got lost when we were in lockdown and people, did not have a normal commute. So looking and identifying all of those opens up a lot of hopefully empathy and understanding for one another, as well as solutions. And then you have interpersonal perception questions for how each person is seeing the scenario, seeing the situation, and helping to put language and words and noticing how one perception reinforced another perception. And so often, right, you can be tired, but you look angry. And so your partner responds in that way as such, and you create this downward negative spiral. And so very, very common with couples, that interpersonal perception, how they interpreted each other's nonverbals, can trigger very negative spirals, especially very quickly if they're well established. Reflexive questions are where, so the circular questions, you're looking at kind of the interaction. Reflexive questions invite clients to reflect on the unwanted implications of their current perceptions and actions. And these are not leading, these are just kind of opening up for reflecting on things. So, what do you think would happen if you fall back into using drugs and rebelling when people ask you to do things again? So how is that going to work? And what would that be like for you? And what's going to be the thing that tends to make you go that way versus, what's keeping you from doing that right now? So being able to just kind of do a lot of this reflecting on what is going on. So SCIPS, they identified so these are the social cultural interpersonal patterns, and they identified 4 different types or strands of these approaches. There is the experiencing, so your individual experience of your social location, social identities, dominant discourses, and how you experience them. And it's so important to know that even though we have these dominant discourses, we have cultural norms, we have subcultural norms, we have an individual family's unique interpretation of the cultures and their cultural intersections, there's still the individual, right? And so the individual, even within a family, can have wide diversity in terms of how they experience social cultural narratives. There is the naming and labeling of experience that a person might be experiencing, and how social cultural discourses kind of affect their experience of these interaction patterns. There's the coupling, so joining the emotional interpersonal behaviors into patterned interactions. So looking at how your emotional and interactional behaviors, inform these other patterns that we're having. And so you're looking at the culture, gender, and other lenses that are attached to these patterns. And then there's collective values, defining what the good life is. That is very much what culture does. We often don't think of that as one of its primary functions, but often embedded in any culture are various definitions of the good life. And so looking at that, looking how there's this cultural norms, subcultural norms around gender, social class, ethno-racial identity, sexual orientation, all of these things, and to be able to step back and reflect on them. And what part of this do we agree with? What part do we not agree with? What part do we want to keep enacting? What part is, contributing to these problems that we're having? And so being able to name these, label these, even with couples, they can have very different experiences. Heterosexual couples talking about just gender norms and how they play into virtually every PIP that a couple will have. Not all, but many, many of them. There are, in heterosexual couples, you have just the layer of just gender discourses, and then you can have their cultural and family of origin influences onto that. So the SCIPS help identify that level of the system, or of what's going on with these patterns. So here's some examples of what SCIPS might look like. You have certain beliefs that inform certain actions. So if you come from, or you choose to adhere to more individualistic beliefs, there's putting the individual need before the that of the other relationships. If you come from more collectivist cultures, it's putting the needs of the family or social group above prioritizing that above the individual. So the belief informs the actions, and so these go together. You have patriarchal entitlement here. It can be the belief that informs the action of males exercising dominance. You can have a belief in gender egalitarian roles, and then you can have males and females sharing power. So these are different ways that you can think about and look at how these kind of interact together to shape our lives, and both our problem interaction patterns and our wellness interaction patterns. So yeah, with gender roles, PIPs tend to become more rigid if the couple has a very kind of heterosexual, sexist gender roles, and they can be more difficult to identify oftentimes in the hips and the whips. So there can be a lot of PIPs based on, stereotypes like heterosexist norms, male sex drive discourses, men always want sex, gendered couple role discourses, gender differences in parenting, gender differences in therapy participation. So gender is one, especially if you do a lot of couples work. And even with same-sex couples, you will even see some of these patterns that are similar emerge in same-sex couples. But, the idea is here to just name, describe, identify these patterns, and have the couple reflect on how they're working or not working for them, and to invite them to, think of ways to transform them, these interaction patterns, but identifying how these different kind of roles reinforce often the problem behavior, but you can also look at how to um, reinforce wellness patterns with certain types of beliefs and actions and how those become interactive. Okay, so that is a quick summary of Karl Tomm's IPScope, and this approach, I think, just really dives deep into complementary patterns and helping understand how they are everywhere. They're in the therapeutic system, they're in our clients' pathologizing patterns, they're in the wellness patterns, or the healing patterns, and even in social cultural patterns. And so beginning to notice these dynamics are usually, this is, if you look at all the different theories across counseling, traditional psychotherapy, family therapy, postmodern, you name it, most approaches will have one way or another addressing these kind of polarities that we get into both individually and relationally. And oftentimes our job as clinicians, whatever we're working on, we are reducing and addressing these complementary and often polarized patterns. Okay, so at this time, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. And otherwise, I just want to thank you for joining me. And hopefully this kind of helped give you a sense of the Karl Tomm IPScope, developed by Karl Tomm and his colleagues up in Calgary. And it really is a wonderful integrative way to think about what we do. You can use it to even think about, no matter what approach you're using, I think there's a way to think about how we, both as therapists, engage with our clients, how our clients engage with each other, and really being on the lookout for these complementary patterns with couples, families, as well as individually in terms of our own internal psyche, to look at these polarities and complementarities and how certain beliefs inform certain actions, and how certain behaviors affect the behaviors of others, and how we really kind of have these sequences of these interpersonal patterns. So, yeah. Oh, getting one question to repeat what IP stands for. It stands for interpersonal pattern, and yes, they do use it also for intrapsychic, but it stands primarily for interactional pattern. Excuse me, interactional pattern is what it stands for. So you can also have it, think of interpersonal, intrapsychic. They all start with I, but interactional is the formal word that Tom and his colleagues use. So great. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was a nice introduction to the IPScope, and hopefully it helps you kind of flesh out some of what is in the integrative chapter. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It was great to have you here, and I wish you well, good luck, and I look forward to hopefully having you join me in another session in the future. Bye-bye.